You're standing in the middle of a crowded medieval marketplace. The cobblestones are slick with mud, the air thick with smoke, and suddenly, a bell rings. Everyone turns. A woman is being dragged through the square, her face locked inside a metal mask, her eyes wide with terror. Townsfolk jeer and spit. Children point and laugh. Her crime? She talked too much. In the Middle Ages, gossip wasn't just rude. It was a threat. Talking behind someone's back could spark blood feuds, divide communities, or get you branded a witch. And if you were a woman, the consequences were even worse. Towns had creative, painful, and humiliating ways of punishing what they called loose tongues, iron masks, public dunkings, shame parades, and in some places, exile, or worse. In this video, we're diving into the brutal, bizarre world of medieval gossip punishment and the disturbing reasons why it mostly targeted women. Because in a time when silence was obedience, speaking up could cost you everything. Stick around. You won't believe how far they went. In today's world, gossip is everywhere. It's on social media. It's in the group chat. It's the side-eye across the office or that, "Did you hear?" at dinner. But in medieval towns, gossip was far more than just annoying chatter. It was seen as a serious social threat. These were tight-knit communities, villages and market towns where everyone knew each other. And that meant everyone's reputation was fragile, public, and often life-defining. One whispered rumor could shatter a marriage, ruin a business, or get someone accused of theft, heresy, or even witchcraft. Worse still, gossip could easily spark a blood feud between families that lasted for generations. So gossip wasn't just impolite, it was dangerous, the kind of thing that could destabilize a town. That's why the church, local councils, and even monarchs began to crack down hard on idle talk. In their view, gossip threatened the moral and social order, especially when it came from people who weren't supposed to have a voice. And you can probably guess who they blamed most. Women. A woman who spoke too freely, too sharply, or too often was called a scold. And a scold needed to be dealt with, publicly, painfully. Because in the medieval mind, silence was obedience. And gossip? That was rebellion. Imagine this. You're accused of being a scold, someone who talks too much, stirs trouble, or speaks out of turn. Maybe you criticized a neighbor. Maybe you made a joke about the wrong man. Maybe someone just didn't like you. And now, you're being fitted with the scold's bridle. It's not just a punishment. It's a statement. This horrific device, also called a brank, was a metal cage that clamped over your entire head like a grotesque medieval muzzle. But the worst part wasn't what it looked like. Inside, pressed against your tongue, was a flat iron plate, or sometimes a spiked bit, designed to prevent you from speaking. If you tried to talk, the metal tore at your mouth. If you tried to move your tongue, pain, bleeding. Some versions even had bells or horns on top, so that wherever you walked, everyone heard your humiliation ringing through the streets. Women were often paraded through the town square, forced to wear the bridle while crowds jeered and mocked them. In some cases, they were chained to the market cross or tied to public pillories for hours, on display like criminals. And that was the point. The scold's bridle wasn't just about silencing you. It was about breaking you. It turned your body into a warning sign. This is what happens when a woman won't shut up. No trial, no appeal. Just public shame, pain, and the hope that fear would do the rest. And here's the chilling part. This wasn't some rare torture. These bridles were standard equipment in many town halls across England and Scotland. Some were engraved with messages like, "Hold thy tongue," or "Peace, woman." Others were even used in churches, yes, churches, as part of their so-called moral correction. If the scold's bridle was too extreme, or just not available, towns had other ways of turning punishment into a public event. Because in the medieval world, justice wasn't just about control, it was about performance. And when it came to gossip, the punishment had to be seen, heard, and remembered by everyone. One of the most common tools, the cucking stool, also known as the gossip's chair or the stool of repentance. The idea was simple. Strap the offender, usually a woman, to a large wooden chair and place it in the most visible part of town, the center of the marketplace, right outside the tavern, or even, ironically, next to the church doors. There she would sit for hours, sometimes days, while people passed by, pointed, laughed, or shouted insults. Her offense might be written on a placard hung around her neck. Scold, gossip, idle tongue. And the worst part? You didn't even have to be guilty. A neighbor's grudge, a jealous rival, or a vengeful husband could be enough to get you tied to the chair. But that was just one version. In some towns, the punishment escalated into dunking, literally. Using a long wooden beam, the cucking stool was lowered into a river or pond, then yanked back up, down again, up again, over and over. You weren't just wet. You were cold, choking, shaking with fear, and being laughed at by your entire community. And this wasn't a quiet affair. There were rhymes, chants, even mock parades. Town criers might shout announcements, "Come one, come all, see the scold get soaked." Children would throw rotten vegetables. Drunk men would jeer. The church would stay silent. The goal wasn't just punishment. It was humiliation as entertainment. Because in a world with no Netflix, other people's pain was the show. And the louder you had been before, the harder the town laughed when you were finally silenced. Now here's the thing. All these punishments, the bridle, the stool, the dunking, the public shaming, they were almost exclusively used on women. Not because men didn't gossip. They did. But in medieval society, a man who spoke out was seen as assertive, political, even bold. A woman who did the same? She was a scold, a nuisance, a threat. And that word, scold, it didn't just mean talkative. It meant unruly, disobedient, too opinionated, too independent. It became a catch-all label slapped on women who spoke without permission, who questioned their husbands, argued with neighbors, or dared to criticize authority. And once you were called a scold, you were marked. There didn't need to be proof. The accusation alone could send you to the stool or the bridle. And here's the twisted logic behind it. Silence was virtue. Obedience was godliness. A quiet woman was a good woman. So these punishments weren't just about gossip. They were about control. The town wasn't trying to stop lies. It was trying to enforce submission. Even the design of the punishments made that clear. The scold's bridle didn't hurt your hands or feet. It hurt your mouth. The gossip stool didn't isolate you in secret. It put you on display. The goal was always the same: break her spirit, silence her voice, and make an example out of her body. Because if one woman was bold enough to speak out, maybe others would too. And in a patriarchal world built on hierarchy, that was the real fear. Here's where things get really absurd. In the middle of all this silencing and shaming, towns had one person literally paid to spread rumors, announcements, and news: the town crier. You know, that guy in a fancy hat, ringing a bell, yelling things like, hear ye, John the baker's barn has burned to the ground." He was allowed, expected, to shout the business of other people in public. And that wasn't seen as gossip. It was official information. But if a woman whispered that same info to her neighbor while fetching water, that was scandal. That was a moral offense. So what's the difference? Simple. Who was talking? Gossip wasn't defined by the content of the speech. It was defined by the speaker. If a man spoke loudly in public, he had authority. If a woman did it, she was disruptive. The town crier wore a uniform. The gossip wore a bridle. Same words, completely different consequences. In fact, some women were punished just for repeating what the town crier had said, if they added their own opinion or tone. That's how fragile the power structure was. You could be punished not for lying, but for interpreting, for showing too much interest, for speaking without permission. It wasn't about truth or falsehood. It was about controlling the flow of information and making sure that women weren't the ones holding the microphone. Because once people start listening to the wrong voice, the whole system shakes. So, what happened if the bridle didn't work? What if the dunking, the stool, the chants, the mockery, none of it made you stay quiet? In some towns, there was only one option left: get rid of you. Chronic scolds, meaning women who kept gossiping, complaining, or just refusing to submit, could be banished. That meant forced exile, thrown out of the town where you were born, raised, married, no home, no protection, no means of survival. And in a world without modern infrastructure or safety nets, banishment was almost a slow death sentence. But in certain times and places, it wasn't slow at all. During periods of moral panic, like plague outbreaks, religious hysteria, or the infamous witch trials, gossip wasn't just punished. It was treated as evidence. She talks too much. She spreads rumors. She cursed someone with her words. Suddenly, you weren't just annoying. You were a witch. And once that accusation landed, it was almost impossible to escape. You might be dragged into a church court, tortured for a confession, forced to name names, then burned, drowned, or hanged, all for a voice they didn't like. It happened again and again, especially to women who were older, widowed, poor, or simply outspoken. And here's the twisted irony. The same town that punished you for gossip would then gossip about your death. She brought it on herself. She wouldn't stop talking. Let that be a lesson to the others. Because in the most extreme cases, medieval justice didn't just want your silence, it wanted your erasure, your voice, your name, your memory, gone. You might be thinking, okay, sure, it was brutal, but that was the Middle Ages. We've moved on, right? Well, sort of. We don't strap women into iron masks anymore. We don't dunk people in rivers, at least not literally. But the mentality behind those punishments, that idea that women who speak too much are dangerous, disruptive, or in need of correction, that's still with us. Today, women in public life, politicians, journalists, creators, even athletes, are often bombarded with shame, mockery, and threats for doing the exact same thing town criers used to do, talking. If you're outspoken, you're too emotional. If you disagree, you're aggressive. If you call something out, you're toxic. It's the modern version of the gossip bridle, only now the punishment is online harassment, cancel campaigns, or being labeled problematic. And it still falls disproportionately on women, queer voices, and marginalized people. The tools have changed, but the instinct to silence, shame, and isolate someone for having the wrong voice, that runs centuries deep. So understanding where these ideas came from, the ducking stools, the bridles, the forced silence, matters more than ever. Because history doesn't just live in museums. It lives in the way we treat people right now. And sometimes, the past is closer than we think. In medieval law, gossip wasn't just gossip. It was what they called a gateway crime. That meant it was seen as the starting point for much bigger problems. Gossip stirred feuds. Feuds sparked fights. Fights could turn into riots, and riots, well, those could threaten the entire social order. That's why many towns kept official scold rolls, actual lists of women accused of gossiping or causing domestic disturbances. If your name ended up on that list, you were under surveillance. One more complaint, and you'd be dragged to court, or worse, publicly punished. And those lists? They followed you. Even if you moved to another village, your reputation moved with you. Some communities even posted gossipers' names on church doors like spiritual most wanted posters. These weren't just random punishments. They were systematic efforts to suppress voices before they could cause too much noise. Not all gossip punishments looked the same. In fact, the methods varied wildly depending on where you lived and how creative your local authorities were feeling. In Scotland, the Scold's bridle often came with bells on top, tiny metal chimes that jingled as you walked, broadcasting your shame. In Germany, they went a step further. Offenders were sometimes forced to wear shame masks, metal face coverings shaped like pigs, donkeys, or even devils. These grotesque caricatures weren't just humiliating. They were meant to imply you were less than human. In France, some women were forced to crawl through the streets on their hands and knees while people threw trash at them. In parts of Italy, gossipers were paraded backwards on donkeys, a symbolic reversal of status. And in certain Slavic regions, they used public whipping posts with signs that read, "She lies," or "loose tongue." These regional punishments weren't just about justice, they were about ritual humiliation. Every detail was designed to turn your body into a lesson for others. See what happens when you speak too freely? Now, to be fair, men weren't completely off the hook. In rare cases, male gossips were punished too, but only when their words became politically dangerous. Say a man spread rumors about a local lord stealing taxes or accused a priest of corruption. That wasn't idle chatter. That was sedition. And the punishment? Far more severe than a bridle. You might be flogged, fined, imprisoned, or even branded on the face with a hot iron. In some parts of Europe, men accused of slander could have their tongues pierced with nails or cut, literally removing the source of the problem. But notice the difference. When women gossiped, it was treated as a moral failing, a failure to be silent, obedient, proper. When men gossiped, it was a threat to power. The same act, two completely different meanings, and two very different forms of punishment. As always, it wasn't about the words, it was about who was speaking. One of the most fascinating real-life stories comes from 17th century England. Her name was Dorothy Waugh, a woman who simply refused to be quiet. She lived in a time when speaking publicly as a woman, especially about religion or injustice, was practically a crime on its own. Dorothy was arrested multiple times for quarreling, preaching, and yes, gossiping. She was publicly whipped, placed in a Scold's bridle, and imprisoned more than once. But she didn't stop. In fact, she became a Quaker preacher, one of the earliest female voices to challenge the church and political authorities of her time. And because she wouldn't stay silent, her voice spread far beyond her village. Today, she's remembered not as a scold, but as a rebel, a trailblazer, and a survivor. Her story proves one thing. Even in a world designed to silence you, some voices can't be broken. You'd think all this would have ended with the Middle Ages, right? Not exactly. In England, laws against scolding stayed on the books well into the 18th and even 19th centuries. The last recorded use of a ducking stool happened in the early 1800s. And, as late as the Victorian era, town halls still displayed Scold's bridles as reminders of what happened to unruly women. But even after the physical punishments faded, the ideas behind them stuck around. Women were still expected to be quiet, modest, and submissive, just in more polite language. And if they weren't, society had new tools: shame, isolation, reputation damage. In many ways, the medieval obsession with female silence didn't disappear. It just went underground, into culture, into religion, into social norms, and into the unspoken rules we're still challenging today. Because when you trace the history of a silenced voice, it often leads straight back to a ducking stool.